Imagine waking up each day knowing the fate of the world could hinge on a single word you decipher. For the brilliant minds hidden away at Bletchley Park, this wasn't a fantasy, it was their daily reality. We are stepping back in time to February 19th, 1943, to walk in the shoes of a World War II codebreaker, uncovering the relentless pressure, the ingenious puzzles, and the quiet triumphs that changed the course of history, one secret message at a time. The morning air in Buckinghamshire during the early 1940s was often thick with a damp, clinging mist that blurred the edges of the horizon. As dawn breaks at Bletchley Park, the first gray light touches the red brick gables of the unassuming Victorian mansion, a structure that looks more like a grand country home than the nerve center of a global shadow war. To the casual observer, the site appeared sleepy, perhaps even abandoned, but this was the ultimate calculated deception. For the codebreaker, beginning their early morning commute, the journey was a rhythmic transition from the domestic safety of a nearby boarding house to the high-stakes silence of Station X. They arrived on bicycles or by foot, moving quietly through the gates, their breath misting in the cold air. There were no fanfares, only the sharp, repetitive crunch of gravel under sensible shoes, and the low, steady murmur of the military police checking identification papers at the perimeter. As you settle into the weightless.com expanse of the evening, imagine the profound atmosphere of urgency that greeted these men and women the moment they stepped inside the wire. The sound was not the roar of engines or the whistle of falling bombs, but a feverish acoustic energy, the rapid staccato click-clack of hundreds of typewriters, and the low, persistent hum of human voices speaking in hushed, technical tones. The air inside the huts was starkly different from the fresh country breeze outside. It was heavy with the smell of stale tea, cigarette smoke, and the metallic temps of machinery. This was the first glimpse into the highly secured, bustling operational rooms. Here, the boredom of a rural estate was shattered by a frantic, invisible battle. The codebreakers did not look like warriors. They were mathematicians, linguists, and chess players. Yet they moved with a strategic purpose that signaled the weight of the lives resting on their shoulders. The hidden worries of the morning shift focused on the peril of the unseen. As they took their seats, the first intercepted signals were already waiting for them, raw, incomprehensible data arriving on teletype machines in a relentless, rhythmic flow. These were the Enigma messages, long strings of seemingly random letters that held the movements of U-boats, the logistics of the Luftwaffe, and the secret orders of the High Command. To the uninitiated, these tapes were nothing more than gibberish, a chaotic mess of ink on paper. But to the codebreaker, this was the enemy's breath. They harbored a secret worry that within this specific batch of data lay a warning they might be too slow to catch. They envisioned a future where a single missed character could lead to the sinking of a convoy in the mid-Atlantic, a thought that turned the boring act of reading tape into a high-tension struggle against time. The teletype machines themselves were the pulse of the park, their mechanical chatter providing the baseline for the entire operation. As the paper ribbon spilled out of the machines, it was immediately whisked away to the various huts for processing. This was the architecture of the secret, a world divided into silos where no one person knew the full picture. Yet everyone understood the gravity of their specific fragment. The codebreaker would stare at the scrambled text, looking for cribs, repeated phrases, or predictable patterns like weather reports or standard greetings that might provide the first crack in the armor of the cipher. This was the anxiety of the first look, the moment of realization that today's settings were different. Today's logic was new, and the great silence of the enemy was once again absolute. The contrast between the Victorian elegance of the mansion and the functional brutality of the wooden huts defines the Bletchley experience. While the directors held meetings in oak-paneled rooms, the real work happened in cramped, poorly ventilated sheds where the temperature dropped in the winter and soared in the summer. They used their boring tools pencils, graph paper, and colored chalk to map out the infinite possibilities of the German machines. They understood that information is the only weapon that doesn't run out of ammunition, a philosophy that kept them glued to their stations, even as the sun began to rise fully over the trees. Their fear was not of the noise, but of the stagnation. The moment when the machines went quiet, or the logic stopped making sense. The dawn at Bletchley was a moment of profound, quiet dedication. It was a time when the individual self was set aside in favor of the collective intellect. They did not seek the fame of the battlefield. They sought the clarity of the solution. They believed that to understand the enemy is to defeat the enemy, a mantra that turned every morning into a fresh assault on the impossible. Their private worries were tucked away, the family members in the blitz, the friends at sea replaced by the rhythm of the decryption. They knew that the world was waking up to a war, and it was their job to ensure that the light of intelligence stayed one step ahead of the darkness. The huts are museums now, and the teletype machines are silent, but the energy of the quiet arrival remains. The belief that the mind can win what the sword cannot offers a sense of protective, intellectual clarity. You are not responsible for the decryption of the world or the safety of the convoys. You are only a dweller within the enduring, quiet history of the great secret. The image of the misty morning and the waiting machines acts as your guide. The day has begun, the watch is set, and the park is stilled by the intensity of the work. You are secure in the steady, unhurried peace of your own rest, where the only thing that matters is the deep stillness of the room. As the clock hands move toward the mid-morning hours, the initial rush of arrival settles into a focused, high-stakes environment. This is the moment where the intellectual battlefield is fully engaged. The morning briefing is the first critical juncture, a time when senior analysts and military liaisons gather to define the intelligence gaps of the day. They do not discuss geography in terms of mountains or rivers, but in terms of signal density and cipher strength. The air in the briefing room is thick with a specific kind of tension, a realization that the enemy's movements are currently masked behind a wall of mathematics. They harbor a secret worry that the Germans have introduced a new rotor to the Enigma machine, or changed their plugboard protocols, which would effectively blind the Allied command. This is a battle of wits, where logic is ammunition, and the primary casualty is time. To understand the scale of this struggle, one must visualize the Enigma machine itself. At first glance, it appears as a heavy, wooden-cased typewriter, but its internal mechanics are a masterpiece of cerebral obfuscation. Inside, a series of 3 or 4 rotors, each wired with complex internal circuits, step forward with every key press. When a codebreaker pressed the letter A, the electrical current would pass through the rotors, bounce off a reflector, and return through a different path to light up a completely different letter on the Lamboard. The number of possible configurations was astronomical. This was the peril of the infinite, a realization that even if 1,000 people worked for 1,000 years, they could never manually test every setting. The machine was designed to be unbreakable, a mathematical fortress that protected the most sensitive secrets of the Reich. The hidden worries of the analysts focused on the peril of the static cipher. They knew that the Enigma settings were changed every 24 hours. This meant that any progress made yesterday was essentially useless today. They envisioned a future where the enemy's intellectual superiority would outpace them. To counter this, Bletchley Park became the birthplace of a technological marvel, the Colossus. While the Enigma was the sword of the enemy, the Colossus was the shield of the Allies. It was the world's first programmable electronic computer, a massive, room-filling array of over 2,500 vacuum tubes that hummed with a persistent, rhythmic heat. The Colossus was designed to tackle the impossible calculations required to crack the even more complex Lorenz ciphers used by the German High Command. Unlike the Enigma, which used rotors, the Lorenz system used 12 wheels to create a nearly impenetrable code. The Colossus did not think in the human sense. It filtered. It read intercepted teletype tapes at a speed of 5,000 characters per second, performing statistical comparisons that would have taken a human team weeks to complete. The sound of the Colossus was a steady, electronic worry, a mechanical heartbeat that signaled the arrival of the digital age. The codebreakers harbored a secret worry that these vacuum tubes' fragile glass cylinders would burn out, plunging the war effort back into the dark. The architecture of the intellectual battlefield was a study in compartmentalized brilliance. In Hut 6 and Hut 8, the mathematicians worked in a state of high vigilance logic, looking for the human errors that the German operators inevitably made. They looked for Silly's predictable three-letter sequences used as indicators or the repeated use of a girlfriend's name. They understood that the machine was perfect, but the operator was human. This was the peril of the habit, the belief that even in a world of complex mathematics, the human element was the weakest link. They used their routine observations to find the cracks in the fortress, turning the enemy's laziness into an Allied victory. The contrast between the abstract mathematics of the code and the physical reality of the war created a unique psychological pressure. A breakthrough in the briefing room meant that a convoy in the North Sea would be rerouted. A failure meant it would be found. They did not see the explosions, but they saw the absence of signals that followed a loss. This created a culture of extreme mental endurance, where the intellectual battlefield was just as exhausting as any physical trench. Their fear was not of the difficulty of the math, but of the consequences of an unsolved equation. The machines are silent now, and the vacuum tubes of the Colossus have been replaced by billions of transistors, but the energy of the breakthrough remains. The belief that logic can dismantle tyranny offers a sense of protective, intellectual clarity. You are not responsible for the calculations of the night, or the monitoring of the vacuum tubes. You are only a dweller within the enduring, quiet history of the great decryption. The image of the spinning rotors and the glowing tubes acts as your guide. The math is solved, the logic is sound, and the park is hushed by the intensity of the achievement. You are secure in the steady, unhurried peace of your own rest, where the only thing that matters is the deep stillness of the room. As the morning deepens, the intellectual labor of the huts transitions into a phase of mechanical industrialization. This is where the abstract logic of the mathematician meets the raw power of the engineer. In the heart of the operation stands the Turing bombe, a device that is perhaps the most critical physical asset in the entire park. The bomb is not a computer in the modern sense, but a high-speed logical filter, a massive clicking apparatus of bronze, copper, and mahogany. It was designed to do what no human mind could: rapidly test millions of possible Enigma rotor settings in a matter of minutes. The sound of the room containing the bombs is a persistent, rhythmic clank-clank-clank, a mechanical heartbeat that fills the air and vibrates through the floorboards. For the operators, mostly women from the Women's Royal Naval Service, the bomb was a living, breathing companion. In the struggle against the dark, the hidden worries of the bomb operators focused on the peril of the mechanical failure. Each machine consisted of 36 Enigma equivalents, essentially vertical drums that mimicked the internal wiring of the German rotors. If a single wire was frayed, or if a single brush failed to make contact, the entire run was invalidated. They harbored a secret worry that a false negative would go unnoticed, wasting precious hours of the day. This created a culture of extreme physical vigilance. The wrens worked in shifts, their hands stained with oil, and their ears tuned to the specific mechanical signature of a healthy machine. They understood that the bomb was a delicate giant, a logical vacuum cleaner, designed to suck the randomness out of the Enigma's output. To visualize the process, one must imagine the crib, the starting point for every bomb run. A crib was a piece of known plaintext, a phrase the codebreakers were certain existed within the encrypted message. The bomb used this fragment as a lever to pry open the encryption. It would cycle through the rotors at a dizzying speed, looking for a setting that did not create a logical contradiction. When the machine found a potential match, it would come to a sudden, jarring halt. This was the breakthrough moment, the shout in the silence that signaled a potential crack in the armor. They envisioned a future where the brute force of the machine would make all secrecy impossible, a technological endgame that changed the nature of war forever. The architecture of the bomb room was a study in industrialized intelligence. The machines were lined up in rows, their spinning drums creating a hypnotic visual field of silver and black. The air was hot and dry, smelling of ozone, hot oil, and the sharp scent of electrical insulation. This was the labor of the machine, a state of repetitive high-intensity rest. Where the mind was focused on the maintenance of the logic, they did not have the luxury of creative thought. They were the guardians of the cycle. They feared the long run, the moments when the bomb would spin for hours without a stop, suggesting that the crib was wrong or the Germans had changed their procedures. To the operator, a quiet machine was a source of profound anxiety. The impact of the Turing bomb on the rhythm of the war was immediate and devastating to the Axis. By reducing the time required to crack a daily key from weeks to hours, the bomb turned static intelligence into dynamic intelligence. They understood that information has a half-life, and a message decrypted 3 days late was nothing more than a historical document. This created a culture of the clock, where every second was a physical weight. The hidden worries of the leadership at Bletchley centered on the peril of discovery. The fear that the Germans would realize their unbreakable code was being read by a machine in the English countryside, and simply stop using it. They used the bomb's success with extreme caution, often fabricating alternative sources to keep the secret of Bletchley safe. The contrast between the organic mind of Alan Turing and the mechanical mind of the bomb highlights the unique partnership of the Park. Turing provided the spark of the logic, but the bomb provided the muscle of the execution. Their fear was not of the machine itself, but of the limitations of the human. They knew that as the war progressed, the codes would only get more complex, and the mechanical pulse would have to beat faster. This was the arms race of the intellect, a struggle that would eventually lead to the birth of the digital world we live in today. The machines have been dismantled, and the rooms where they hummed are now silent galleries, but the energy of the mechanical pulse remains. The belief that structure can defeat chaos offers a sense of protective, industrial clarity. You are not responsible for the maintenance of the rotors or the verification of the cribs. You are only a dweller within the enduring, quiet history of the great machine. The image of the spinning drums and the sudden stop acts as your guide. The setting is found, the logic is confirmed, and the park is hushed by the rhythm of the solution. You are secure in the steady, unhurried peace of your own rest, where the only thing that matters is the deep stillness of the room. As the sun reaches its zenith over the rolling hills of Buckinghamshire, the intense, claustrophobic atmosphere of the huts is briefly broken by the noontime migration. This is the move to the canteen sanctuary, a large utilitarian hall that served as the primary pressure valve for the thousands of workers at Bletchley Park. In the canteen, the rigid compartmentalization of the work was momentarily softened, though the great secret still loomed over every table. This was the anxiety of the spoken word, a constant, low-level awareness that even a casual remark about rotors or cribs could be a security breach. To eat in the canteen was to participate in a collective silence, a state of social rest where the most important things were the things that remained unsaid. As you settle into the steady, unmoving calm of the evening, imagine the atmosphere of the canteen during the height of the war. The sound was a dense tapestry of noise, the clatter of heavy ceramic plates, the scrape of wooden chairs on linoleum, and the low hum of hundreds of simultaneous conversations. The air was thick with the smell of boiled cabbage, strong tea, and the persistent damp wool of uniforms. This was the rhythm of the mundane in the middle of a clandestine storm. The workers harbored a secret worry about the peril of the slip, fearing that the immense intellectual pressure they were under would eventually vent itself in a moment of indiscretion. To manage this, they developed a culture of coded humor and abstract talk, discussing music, chess, or literature as a way to distract the mind from the encrypted reality of the huts. The hidden worries of the security staff focused on the peril of the stranger. They envision a future where an infiltrator could glean the nature of the work simply by observing the stress levels or the vocabulary of the diners. This led to a state of enforced social isolation, where the people of Bletchley were encouraged not to fraternize with the locals in the nearby town. This isolation created an intense, inward-looking community, a secret family bound by a shared burden. They understood that friendship is a security risk, a philosophy that made the simple act of sharing a meal a political statement. They used their boring canteen rituals, the queuing for tea, the sharing of limited sugar rations, to create a sense of normalcy in an abnormal world. The role of the canteen as a sanctuary was vital for the mental resilience of the codebreakers. For someone like Alan Turing or Gordon Welchman, the canteen was a place where the infinite math could be briefly paused. They viewed the break as a reset for the eyes, a chance to stop staring at strings of letters and start looking at human faces. They harbored a secret worry about burnout, knowing that a mind pushed too far for too long would eventually shatter. This was the peril of the single focus, the belief that without the interruption of the human, the logic would eventually turn on itself. They used the canteen noise as a form of auditory white noise, a way to drown out the clanking of the bombs that continued to echo in their ears. The lunch in the canteen was also a place of subtle hierarchy. The professors often sat in their own quiet corners, their minds still visibly churning, while the wrens and the clerks filled the center of the hall with a more energetic, youthful energy. This social geography reflected the layers of the secret. The person serving the soup knew nothing of the U-boat locations being plotted. Yet they were an essential part of the logistical machine that kept the park running. They envisioned a world where the contribution of the small was just as vital as the genius of the few. This was a collective victory, the belief that the canteen wins the war as much as the hut. The contrast between the internal intensity of code breaking and the external simplicity of the meal highlights the sacrifice. They were surrounded by the boring details of a wartime diet: gray bread, limited meat, and endless tea. Yet they were handling information that could change the fate of empires. Their fear was not of deprivation, but of futility. The thought that all their effort might be for nothing. If the messages they cracked were not acted upon by the generals, they used canteen time to re-anchor themselves in the real world, fighting for a future where a meal could be shared, without the shadow of the secret. The canteen is a museum cafe now, and the clatter of the plates is the sound of tourists rather than tired heroes. But the energy of the shared burden remains. The belief that community is the best defense offers a sense of protective social comfort. You are not responsible for the guarding of the secret or the maintenance of the silence. You are only a guest in the enduring, quiet history of the secret table. The image of the steaming cup of tea and the hushed conversation acts as your guide. The meal is finished, the tension is eased, and the canteen is hushed by the return to work. You are secure in the steady, unhurried peace of your own rest, where the only thing that matters is the deep stillness of the room. Once the noonday reprieve of the canteen has passed, the codebreaker returns to the desk to face the methodical decryption. The core, painstakingly slow work that turns chaos into clarity. This is the heart of the intellectual battlefield, a place where the human mind engages in a direct, one-on-one struggle with the machine. To the uninitiated, the process looks like a tedious exercise in paperwork. But for those inside Hut 6 or Hut 8, it was a high-stakes hunt. This was the anxiety of the lost link, the realization that a single misplaced letter or a slight misunderstanding of a German operator's habits could lead to a dead end that wasted hours of precious time. To decrypt a message was to perform a surgical extraction of the truth from a mountain of lies. As you settle into the steady, unmoving calm of your own space, imagine the visual landscape of a decryption desk. The sound was the scratch-scratch of a graphite pencil on coarse, wartime paper and the dry rustle of massive codebooks. The air was filled with a static tension, a collective silence so deep that the ticking of a wall clock sounded like a hammer blow. The codebreaker didn't start with the whole message. They started with the indicator. This was a 3-letter group sent at the very beginning of a transmission that told the recipient how to set their Enigma rotors for that specific message. The Germans believed this was a perfect shield, but the codebreakers knew better. They harbored a secret worry about analytical blindness, fearing that they would miss the one human error, the silly that would provide the key to the entire day's traffic. The methodical decryption followed a rigorous, step-by-step logic. First came the cribbing. The codebreaker would take a piece of suspected plaintext, perhaps a morning weather report, slide it along the ciphertext, looking for a place where no letter encrypted to itself, a unique flaw of the Enigma machine. They envisioned a future where the brute force of the bombs would do this automatically. But in the early days, it was a manual labor of pattern recognition. Once a match was found, they would create a logical map of the connections between letters. They feared the false match, viewing it as a mirage in the desert that would lead the entire team astray. This was a logical discipline, the belief that the math never lies, even if the eyes do. The second step was the bomb run, where the manual menu was translated into a machine search. This was the peril of the wait. For 30 minutes or more, the codebreaker would wait for a stop on the machine, their mind hovering between hope and dread. When the machine stopped, it provided a set of potential rotor positions. The codebreaker would then take these settings back to a Type X machine, a British version of the Enigma test decrypt the message. They harbored a secret worry about the second encryption, the fear that the message was double enciphered, or used a specialized officer-only code that they had not yet broken. This was the peril of the threshold. The moment where you are almost inside the mind of the enemy, yet still locked out by a single, unseen bolt. The final step was the translation and collation. Once the letters began to form actual German words, the methodical decryption shifted from mathematics to intelligence analysis. The codebreaker had to be more than a mathematician. They had to be a linguist and a psychologist. They had to understand German military jargon and the specific shorthand of individual operators. They understood that decryption is just the beginning, a philosophy that made the collation of the data just as vital as the cracking of the code. They used their routine observations to build a mental map of the German military machine, turning fragments of text into a coherent picture of the war. The architecture of the decryption desk was a masterpiece of information management. Everything was standardized. The colors of the pencils, the layout of the worksheets, and the security stamps used to mark a message as ultra. They feared the information leak, believing that the cleanliness of the process was the only thing protecting the source of the knowledge. To the codebreaker, order was not a choice. It was a necessity of survival. They envisioned a world where sloppy work was a form of treason, a belief that kept them focused through the exhausting hours of the afternoon. The contrast between abstract letters and physical reality was the ultimate reward. One moment, a meaningless jumble. The next, exact coordinates of a German fleet. This moment of clarity was their driving force. Their fear wasn't workload, but silenced days when methodical decryption yielded no meaningful word. Successes fueled their next hunt, knowing every broken code meant a saved life. Desks are empty, pencils stilled for decades, yet the energy of methodical search remains. Patience unlocks secrets, offering protective, intellectual clarity. You're not responsible for settings or jargon. You are a dweller within the enduring, quiet history of the Great Decipherment. The sliding crib and first German word guide you. The pattern is found, secret out, park hushed by discovery's weight. Secure in unhurried peace, only deep stillness matters. As late afternoon shadows stretch, a different pressure settles, not cipher strain, but the emotional weight of the war. This was the anxiety of the invisible witness, the heavy realization that while physically safe, they were mentally present on every sinking ship and burning battlefield. To work at Bletchley was to live in a dual reality. On the surface, routine office work, tea breaks, bicycle rides. Beneath, life and death decisions. In real time, they harbored a secret worry that their personal failure, slow decryption, or a missed indicator would manifest as a physical tragedy hundreds of miles away. As you settle into the weightless.com expanse of the evening, imagine the psychological landscape of a codebreaker who has just decrypted a message destined for a U-boat pack. The sound was not the crash of waves, but the dead silence of the room as the coordinates were plotted on a map. The air was thick with a moral gravity. They knew things sailors didn't, where wolf packs hid, where torpedoes aimed. They envisioned an intellectual shield strong enough to protect everyone. But in the present, they lived with the peril of the partial victory. Sometimes they cracked a message too late, carrying that silence home at shift's end. The hidden worries focused on the peril of the godlike choice. Because Ultra was so precious, Allied Command couldn't act on every intelligence piece. This meant codebreakers often saw impending disasters they knew wouldn't be stopped. This was the anxiety of the passive observer. They understood secrecy is a cruel master, requiring them to harden hearts against individual loss for ultimate victory. Routine focus was psychological armor. The emotional weight also stemmed from the absence of recognition. Unlike soldiers, Bletchley workers could tell no one what they did. They lived in permanent omission, social isolation growing heavier. They worried they'd be viewed as shirkers, not in uniform on the front lines. This invisible sacrifice created unique internal fatigue, a sense their true selves were erased by the great secret. They envisioned a world where they could finally speak the truth. But for now, they found solace in the silence of their colleagues. The architecture of emotional support at Bletchley was informal but vital. They relied on small, intense friendships, the camaraderie of the secret, to manage stress. Because they couldn't talk to the outside, they talked to each other. They understood that trust is the only currency, a belief that turned their coworkers into their entire world. They used intellectual distractions to vent pressure. These boring diversions were actually survival mechanisms, essential tools for maintaining the mental health of a workforce pushed to the brink of exhaustion. The contrast between the quiet woods of Buckinghamshire and the violent messages on the tape was the ultimate source of their cognitive dissonance. They would step out of a hut where they had just read an order for a mass execution or a naval ambush and find themselves in a peaceful garden filled with birdsong. This whiplash of the spirit was the tax of the intelligence worker. Their fear was not of the enemy's strength, but of their own internal collapse. The moment when the weight of the war would become too heavy to lift. They used the rhythm of the work to keep moving, turning decryption into defiance. The huts are now places of quiet reflection, and the weight of the war has been lifted by time, but the energy of the sacrifice remains. The belief that heaviest burdens are carried in silence offers protective, emotional clarity. You are not responsible for command decisions or convoy safety. You are only a dweller within the enduring, quiet history of the secret sacrifice. The image of mapped coordinates and unspoken truth acts as your guide. The burden is recognized, the silence is honored, and the park is hushed by the weight of the past. You are secure in the steady, unhurried peace of your own rest, where the only thing that matters is the deep stillness of the room. In the late afternoon, when the brain feels stretched, the moment of aha often arrives. A sudden electric shift from confusion to clarity. This is the thrill of the pattern, the instant where jumbled letters align into a recognizable shape. For the cryptanalyst, this was not just professional success. It was a physical sensation, a rush of blood that momentarily erased the fatigue of previous hours. This was the anxiety of the near-miss, the fear that the solution was sitting right in front of them, hidden only by their own mental fog. To find the crack in the code was to perform an act of intellectual levitation, rising above the mechanical traps set by the Enigma operators. As you settle into the steady, unmoving calm of the evening, imagine the atmospheric shift in a hut when a breakthrough occurs. The sound was not a cheer, but a collective indrawing of breath, a sharp, silent realization that the wall had finally crumbled. The air seemed to clear, the smell of stale tea and dust momentarily forgotten. The codebreaker harbors a secret worry about the false positive, the dread that what looks like a pattern is actually just a statistical fluke. They envision a future where the moment of discovery is shared with the world, but the aha must be tempered by verification. They check the logic again, their pencil moving with a feverish precision, until the first German word emerges from the fog of the cipher. The hidden worries of the mathematician focused on the peril of the human habit. They understood that the Enigma machine was a mathematical god, but the men operating it were creatures of habit. Perhaps a German clerk was using the same initial settings every day, or a naval officer was sending a predictable null message. They envisioned a world where laziness was the ultimate vulnerability, a belief that turned the study of the mundane into a weapon of war. They used these predictable patterns, the silliest, to bypass the infinite and find the one true path through the rotors. The recognition of the pattern was a deeply intuitive act. While the Turing bombs provided the muscle, the aha required human creativity. It was the ability to see a relationship between letters that should not exist, or to sense a rhythmic anomaly in radio data. They understood that decryption is an art form disguised as a science, a philosophy that encouraged them to think like the enemy. They harbored a secret worry about mental rigidity, fearing that if they became too mechanical, they would lose the creative edge. This was the peril of the expert, to fear that knowing too much would prevent them from seeing the obvious. The impact of the aha moment on the collective morale of Bletchley was profound. Because the work was so fragmented, a breakthrough in one hut often provided the missing piece for another. They lived in a state of mutual dependency, where one person's clarity could unlock the doors for 1,000 others. They understood that genius is a team sport, a belief that turned the solitary desk into a node in a global network. They used their successes to recharge the room, creating a momentum of the intellect that allowed them to push through the darkest hours. The aha was the fuel that kept the intelligence machine running. The architecture of the breakthrough was a study in incremental progress. A major crack rarely happened all at once. It was a slow accumulation of small patterns that eventually reached a tipping point. They feared the disruption of the flow, believing that if the rhythm of discovery was broken, the pattern would vanish. To manage this, they worked in continuous cycles, handing over their half-finished thoughts to the next shift with meticulous care. They envisioned a world where the chain of thought was never broken, a temporal bridge that spanned the entire duration of the war. The contrast between the abstract joy of the solution and the physical reality of the war was never far from their minds. An aha in Buckinghamshire meant that a U-boat in the Atlantic was now visible to the Royal Navy. this telepathic connection to the battlefield, was the source of their secret power. Their fear was not of the math getting harder, but of the enemy getting smarter. The moment when the Germans would fix their habits, they used their current successes with a sense of preemptive mourning, knowing that every broken cipher had a limited lifespan. The worksheets are archived now, and the thrill of the pattern has been replaced by the certainty of history. But the energy of the breakthrough remains. The belief that there is always a pattern to be found offers a sense of protective, intellectual clarity. You are not responsible for the recognition of the habit or the verification of the logic. You are only a dweller within the enduring, quiet history of the great insight. The image of the aligned letters acts as your guide. The secret is out, the logic is broken, and the park is hushed by the power of the aha. You are secure in the deep stillness of the room. As the sun begins to dip below the horizon, casting long amber shadows across the manor's grounds, the deciphered message undergoes a final transformation. It ceases to be a mathematical puzzle and becomes operational intelligence. This is the moment where the work of a single codebreaker translates into survival. This was the anxiety of the immediate consequence, the realization that the piece of paper was the most powerful object in the world. To produce a cracked message was to hold the thread of fate in one's hands. As you settle into the weightless.com expanse of the evening, imagine the visual journey of a message from Hut 6 to the Admiralty in London. The sound was the sharp, urgent snap of a typewriter and the whir of the teleprinter as the text was transmitted over secure lines. The air was charged with a heavy significance. A single deciphered message triggered a massive, invisible machinery of war. They harbored a secret worry about transmission error, the dread that a single digit could be mistyped, sending the Royal Navy to an empty patch of ocean. They envisioned a future where information superiority would end the war entirely. But for now, they focused on the impact of the single line. The hidden worries of the analysts focused on the peril of the double-edged sword once a message was deciphered. Allied commanders faced a moral and strategic dilemma: how to use the information without revealing its source. They understood that if a British destroyer appeared at the exact secret coordinates too many times, the Germans would realize the Enigma was compromised. This led to a state of calculated restraint, where breakthroughs were often ignored for the sake of the long-term secret. They harbored a secret worry that their personal sacrifice would be wasted in the name of a broader strategy they could not see. They envisioned a world where truth was a weapon that had to be hidden to remain sharp. The impact of a single message was most visible in the Battle of the Atlantic. When a codebreaker identified a Wolfpack patrol line, the entire rhythm of the convoy would change. Hundreds of merchant ships carrying food and fuel would be ordered to turn in silence, pivoting away from the unseen danger. This was the invisible rescue. Thousands of men were saved without ever knowing they had been in peril. The codebreakers understood that silence is the highest form of victory, a philosophy that made their anonymous work the bedrock of the war effort. They used their routine plotting of coordinates to ghostwrite the history of the sea, turning the encrypted threat into a steered path. The architecture of the intelligence impact was a masterpiece of speed and secrecy. Within minutes of a breakthrough, the ultra message reached the highest levels of government. They feared the peril of the slow response, believing that information was a perishable good that lost its value with every passing hour. This created a culture of the urgent present, where the park never truly slept. They envisioned a world where the intellectual speed of Bletchley was the only thing standing between the Allies and total defeat. To the worker in the hut, the impact was not a statistic. It was a physical reality that they could sense in the gravity of the officers' faces as they hurried between buildings. The contrast between the abstract text and the violent reality of the war created a unique burden of knowledge. A codebreaker might read an order for an air raid on a specific city and know hours before the sirens rang what was coming. This foreknowledge was the source of their quiet trauma. Their fear was not of the math failing, but of the human limitation. The moment when the intelligence was clear, but the response was impossible. They used their successes to insulate the mind, focusing on the lives saved rather than the losses predicted. The single message was their contribution to the light. The teleprinters have been replaced by fiber optics, and the ultra-secret is now a matter of public record. But the energy of the impactful word remains. The belief that knowledge is the ultimate shield offers a sense of protective, intellectual clarity. You are not responsible for the rerouting of the convoys or the protection of the secret. You are only a dweller within the enduring, quiet history of the Great Intervention. The image of the turning fleet and the silent signal acts as your guide. The message is sent, the path is steered, and the park is hushed by the weight of the result. You are secure in the steady, unhurried peace of your own rest, where the only thing that matters is the deep stillness of the room. As twilight deepens and the perimeter lights of the park begin to flicker to life, we must consider the human element, the diverse, eccentric, and largely anonymous army of individuals who formed the soul of Bletchley Park. This was not a military monoculture. It was a cerebral melting pot where world-class mathematicians from Cambridge rubbed shoulders with debutantes, chess champions, crossword enthusiasts, and museum curators. This was the anxiety of the unlikely hero, the realization that the defense of Western civilization rested not on generals, but on a group of outsiders who were often more comfortable with an ancient Greek text or a logic puzzle than a rifle. To walk the grounds of Bletchley was to see a cross-section of the intellect, a society of forgotten heroes who were sworn to a silence that would last for decades. As you settle into the steady, unmoving calm of the evening, imagine the social fabric of the park. The sound was a polyglot of accents, the refined vowels of the university elite mixing with the sharp, rhythmic tones of the London clerks, and the steady, regional voices of the Women's Royal Naval Service. The air was charged with a democratic intensity. Inside the huts, the social hierarchies of the outside world were largely discarded in favor of a meritocracy of the mind. They harbored a secret worry about intellectual isolation, the fear that their unique talents would make them unfit for a normal life. They envisioned a future where their boring anonymity would be their only shield, a self-imposed erasure that was the ultimate price of their service. The hidden worries of the wrens and the clerks focused on the peril of the unseen contribution, while Alan Turing and Gordon Welchman provided the theoretical sparks. It was the thousands of women who performed the heavy lifting. They operated the bombs, sorted the endless piles of intercept tapes, and maintained the massive index cards that served as the park's collective memory. They envisioned a world where their tireless repetition was recognized, but in the present they were often treated as invisible hands. They understood that precision is a form of courage, a philosophy that kept them focused through the exhausting cycles of the night shift. Their fear was not of the work, but of the error, the thought that a single misfiled card could break the chain of intelligence. The architecture of the human element was a study in compartmentalized secrecy. Most workers knew only the specific task in front of them. They were cogs in a machine too vast for any one person to see. This created a state of fragmented purpose, where a worker might spend years indexing weather reports without ever knowing that their data helped determine the date of D-Day. They harbored a secret worry about futility, fearing that their small, repetitive work was meaningless in the face of a global war. To manage this, they developed a culture of quiet pride, a belief that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. They used their routine tasks to anchor the spirit, turning the monotony into a meditative act of service. The human element also included the eccentric and the non-conforming. Bletchley was a haven for those whose minds worked differently. They understood that innovation comes from the edges, a philosophy that allowed odd habits to be tolerated as long as they produced results. They feared the standardized mind, believing that if they all thought the same way, the Germans would eventually predict their logic. To the forgotten heroes, their uniqueness was their greatest weapon. They used their divergent thinking to outmaneuver the machine, turning their personal quirks into strategic advantages. They envisioned a world where brilliance was measured by impact rather than uniformity. The contrast between the profound secrecy of the shift and the mundane reality of the boarding house was the ultimate test of their character. They would spend 8 hours handling the secrets of kings and then return to a cold room and a meal of rationed bread, unable to say a word. This social camouflage was the source of their quiet strength. Their fear was not of being found out, but of failing the secret. The moment when the burden of the truth would become too much to bear, they used the silence to insulate the self, creating a private world. The gates of Bletchley are open now, and the forgotten heroes have finally been allowed to speak. But the energy of the unsung contribution remains. The belief that every hand is a hero's hand offers protective social clarity. You are not responsible for the indexing of the tapes or the guarding of the secret. You are only a dweller within the enduring, quiet history of the anonymous victory. The image of the thousands of cards and the unbroken vow acts as your guide. The shift is over, the secret is kept, and the park is hushed by the weight of the legacy. You are secure in the steady, unhurried peace of your own rest, where the only thing that matters is the deep stillness of the room. As the moon takes its position over the dark, quiet silhouette of the Buckinghamshire hills, the Codebreaker enters the final phase of their day, the post-shift wind-down. This was not a simple transition, but a complex psychological decompression. To leave the high-voltage atmosphere of the Hutsware, the air was charged with the heat of the machines and the electricity of the breakthrough, and return to the slow, rhythmic silence of the countryside was a jarring experience. This was the anxiety of the residual code, the persistent internal hum of the mind that continued to shuffle through letters and patterns even after the desk was cleared. They harbored a secret worry that they had left the true self back in the hut, and that the person walking home was merely a ghost of the ordinary. As you settle into the steady, unmoving calm of the evening, imagine the atmosphere of the park at midnight during a shift change, on gravel and the soft clicking of bicycle chains, as hundreds of workers moved in opposite directions. The air was cold, smelling of damp earth and night air, a sharp contrast to the stale, metallic scent of the operational rooms. The codebreaker did not go home to discuss their day. They went home to bury it. They practiced a form of intentional amnesia, a psychological wall designed to separate the world of the secret from the world of the home. They envisioned a future where the weight of the war would be lifted. But for now, they relied on boring rituals, a cup of weak cocoa, the reading of a novel, or a quiet walk through the village to dull the edge of the day's intensity. The hidden worries of the weary mind focused on the peril of the unresolved puzzle. Often, a codebreaker would leave their station, just as a new pattern was beginning to emerge. This led to a state of nocturnal hypervigilance, where the brain continued to spin the rotors in sleep. They envisioned a world where rest was a betrayal, a belief that made the act of closing one's eyes feel like abandoning the watch. To manage this, they developed a culture of shared trust, a realization that the next shift was just as capable and dedicated as the last. They used this continuity to give themselves permission to rest. They understood that a tired mind is a dangerous mind, a philosophy that turned sleep into a strategic necessity rather than a luxury. The post-shift wind-down was also a time of internal auditing. In the quiet of their boarding house rooms, they would review the ethical cost of their work. They harbored a secret worry about the peril of the hidden truths, the knowledge of things that could never be shared. This isolation of the soul was the most exhausting part of the Bletchley experience. They feared that the great secret was a permanent mark that would prevent them from ever truly connecting with others again. To the codebreaker, privacy was not just a lack of company, it was a fortress they had built to protect the world from the burden of what they knew. They used the routine of the village life to re-anchor themselves, finding comfort in the predictable rhythms of the seasons and the land. The architecture of the social disconnect was reinforced by the official Secrets Act. Every worker at Bletchley was reminded that loose lips sink ships. This was not just a slogan, it was a moral compass. They feared the peril of the accidental word, the moment when a tired slip in a local pub or a murmur in sleep could destroy the entire ultra operation. This created a state of permanent guardedness, where the wind down was never truly a letting go. They lived in a controlled environment of their own making, where the silence was their most trusted companion. They envisioned a world where they could speak freely, but until then, they found rest in the structure of the vow they had taken. The contrast between the mental complexity of the decryption and the physical simplicity of the bed was the ultimate source of their nocturnal peace. They would lie in a simple iron bed under heavy wool blankets and listen to the wind in the trees instead of the clatter of the bombs. This sensory shift was the healing balm for the fractured intellect. Their fear was not of the dark, but of the noise. The thought that the clinking of the rotors would never stop echoing in their minds. They used the silence of the room to reset the clock, preparing the internal machine for the fresh assault of the morning. The boarding houses have been modernized, and the bicycles have long since rusted away. But the energy of the post-shift surrender remains. The belief that every mind needs a sanctuary offers a sense of protective, psychological clarity. You are not responsible for the guarding of the secret or the monitoring of the code. You are only a dweller within the enduring, quiet history of the secret rest. The image of the cold room and the single candle acts as your guide. The shift is finished, the mind is stilled, and the park is hushed by the night. You are secure in the steady, unhurried peace of your own rest, where the only thing that matters is the deep stillness of the room. As the war progressed and the intelligence harvest grew from a trickle to a flood, the physical landscape of Bletchley Park underwent a transformation into a silent city. This was the architecture of secrecy, a sprawling, haphazard expansion of timber, concrete, and brick that was never intended to be permanent, yet became the most important construction project in Britain. To walk through the park in the middle of the war was to experience a functional maze. This was the anxiety of the expanding shadow, the fear that as the site grew to house nearly 10,000 workers, it would become a visible target for the Luftwaffe. They harbored a secret worry that the unassuming mansion was no longer enough to hide the industrial scale of the work. To manage this, they built with a calculated ugliness, ensuring that, from the air, the nerve center of Allied intelligence looked like nothing more than a collection of boring agricultural sheds and storage units. As you settle into the steady, unmoving calm of the evening, imagine the atmosphere of the park as it evolved into a 24-hour operation. The sound was the persistent hammering and sawing of construction crews building new huts, even as the old ones hummed with activity. The air was filled with the scent of freshly poured concrete, creosote, and the damp sawdust of a project that was perpetually behind schedule. The architecture was not designed for comfort. It was designed for compartmentalized efficiency. Each hut was a self-contained world. The workers in Hut 3 had no reason to speak to those in Hut 6, and the physical layout of the site reinforced this enforced ignorance. They envisioned a future where the geometry of the space was the ultimate safeguard, a belief that turned cramped hallways and windowless rooms into fortresses of the mind. The hidden worries of the site. Planners focused on the peril of the centralized failure. They understood that if a single bomb hit the main mansion, the brain of the operation would be lost. This led to a state of strategic dispersal, where critical functions were spread across the grounds and eventually to outstations in the surrounding countryside. This fragmentation of the physical site mirrored the fragmentation of the knowledge. They harbored a secret worry about logistical chaos, fearing that the silent city would become so complex that the left hand of the intelligence service would lose track of what the right hand was doing. To manage this, they developed a culture of extreme internal discipline, a realization that order in the building was the only way to ensure order in the code. The architecture of secrecy also had a thermal and sensory cost. The huts were notoriously poorly insulated, freezing in the winter and sweltering in the summer. They used pot-bellied stoves that provided a localized heat but left the corners of the rooms in a permanent chill. The workers harbored a secret worry about environmental fatigue, knowing that the harsh conditions would eventually erode the mental precision required for code breaking. They envisioned a world where luxury was a room with a steady temperature and a window that actually opened. This was a physical sacrifice, the belief that the comfort of the worker is secondary to the safety of the secret. They used their boring struggles with drafts and leaky roofs as a way to stay grounded in the grit. It became the symbolic anchor, a place for the top-secret meetings of the directors and the visits of Big Three dignitaries like Winston Churchill. Yet, even within the mansion, the architecture was one of curated access. Behind every oak-paneled door lay a guarded world. They understood that secrecy is a series of layers, a philosophy that turned the grand staircase into a checkpoint. Their fear was not of the external enemy, but of the internal leak, the moment when the privacy of the building was compromised by a stray document or an overheard whisper. They used thick curtains and double-layered doors to blanket the noise of the world's most important conversations. The contrast between the grand Victorian past of the estate and the brutal technological future of the huts was the ultimate visual paradox. In the shadows of the ornate gables, the world's first computers were being built in sheds that looked like they should be housing garden tools. This aesthetic deception was the source of their survival. Their fear was not of being ugly, but of being noticed. They used the camouflage of the ordinary to hide the extraordinary, a strategy that turned the entire site into a living lie. They envisioned a world where the most important things are always the ones you don't look at twice. The huts have been restored now, and the silent city is a place of historical pilgrimage. But the energy of the calculated sprawl remains. The belief that structure must serve the secret offers a sense of protective architectural clarity. You are not responsible for the maintenance of the huts or the guarding of the perimeter. You are only a dweller within the enduring, quiet history of the hidden nerve center. The image of the unassuming shed and the glowing vacuum tube acts as your guide. The walls are thin, but the secret is thick, and the park is hushed by the weight of its own design. You are secure in the steady, unhurried peace of your own rest, where the only thing that matters is the deep stillness of the room, while the intellectual heart of the operation beat within the huts of Bletchley Park. Its nervous system extended far beyond the Buckinghamshire borders, reaching out across the oceans and into the very skies of Europe. This was the global reach of Signal's intelligency massive, invisible web of way stations that acted as the eyes and ears of the codebreakers. Without these remote outposts, Bletchley would have been a brain without a body, a silent engine with no fuel. For the thousands of operators stationed at these lonely listening posts, the night was a sonic vigil. This was the anxiety of the lost frequency, the constant, low-level dread that a critical German transmission was skipping through the atmosphere, unheard and unrecorded, because of a slight atmospheric disturbance or a moment of operator fatigue. As you settle into the weightless, calm expanse of the evening, imagine the atmosphere of a way station on the rugged cliffs of Kent or the wind-swept coast of Scotland. The sound was the persistent, rhythmic static of the shortwave radio IC of white noise that the operator had to navigate with surgical ears. Through the hiss and crackle, they listened for the staccato ghost of Morse code, the dit-dit dot of a German naval officer or a Luftwaffe navigator. The air in these stations was sharp with the scent of hot radio valves, ionized air, and the salty temps of the nearby sea. The operators harbored a secret worry that the enemy's voice was becoming too faint to hear, or that the Germans had shifted to a new frequency that they had not yet mapped. They envisioned a future where silence was the ultimate weapon, a belief that turned every audible beep into a victory of the spirit. The hidden worries of the way station operators focused on the peril of the misheard character. They understood that they were the first link in the chain of intelligence. If they misrecorded a single letter of the encrypted German text, the mathematicians at Bletchley would be chasing a logical phantom for hours. This created a culture of extreme auditory discipline. They wore heavy, bakelite headphones that pressed against their ears for 8 hours at a time. creating a private world of sound. They harbored a secret worry about mental drift, fearing that the monotony of the static would eventually lull them into a state where they would miss the subtle shift in the rhythm that signaled a priority message. To manage this, they developed a telepathic connection to their equipment, learning to feel the presence of a signal even before it was fully audible. The architecture of the listening post was designed for electronic sensitivity. These stations were often located in remote, electrically quiet areas to minimize interference from local power lines or machinery. They were the monasteries of the airwaves. Inside, rows of operators sat at communication receivers, their hands constantly tuning the dials with the delicacy of a safecracker. They envisioned a world where the entire globe was a map of signals, a philosophy that made the empty air feel crowded with information. They feared the peril of the solar flare, the moment when the heavens themselves would interfere with the war, blacking out the radio spectrum and leaving the Allies deaf to the enemy's movements. The role of the direction-finding DF stations was a critical sublayer of this global reach, using multiple Y stations to triangulate the source of a signal. The Allies could pinpoint the exact location of a U-boat or a mobile radio truck without even needing to crack the code. This was the geometry of the hunt. They understood that where a message comes from is often as important as what it says. A philosophy that turned the lonely coastline into a tactical weapon. Their fear was not of the message itself, but of the movement, the moment when the target vanished from the radio map, suggesting they had gone silent for a pending attack. They used their routine plotting of bearings to shadow the enemy through the dark, creating a nocturnal geography that was invisible to the naked eye. The contrast between the solitude of the Y station and the feverish activity of the huts was a study in connected isolation. The operators on the coast never saw the bombs or the colossus, and they rarely knew the impact of the messages they intercepted. They lived in a state of faith, believing that the reams of paper they filled with 5-letter code groups were being used for a higher purpose. This blind service was the ultimate form of forgotten heroism. Their fear was not of the war reaching them, but of being forgotten by the war, the thought that they were shouting into a void that no one was listening to. They used the rhythm of the Morse to anchor their purpose, turning the meaningless letters into a sacred duty. The radio valves have gone cold, and the Y stations have been converted into cottages or returned to the wild. But the energy of the invisible watch remains. The belief that the world is full of hidden voices offers a sense of protective, atmospheric clarity. You are not responsible for the tuning of the frequencies or the recording of the Morse. You are only a dweller within the enduring, quiet history of the global listeners. The image of the glowing radio dial and the steady dit-da acts as your guide. The frequency is held, the signal is caught, and the air is hushed by the weight of the secret. You are secure in the steady, unhurried peace of your own rest, where the only thing that matters is the deep stillness of the room, as the mechanical and intellectual engines of Bletchley Park hummed through the night. A silent, parallel struggle was being waged, the logistics of the secret. To process the millions of encrypted messages flowing in from the Y stations, the park required a staggering amount of physical material. This was the anxiety of the paper mountain, the realization that the most sophisticated intelligence operation in history was built upon a foundation of pencil lead, carbon paper, and millions of index cards. They harbored a secret worry that the sheer weight of the data would eventually collapse the system, burying the critical needle of truth under a haystack of bureaucratic clutter. To manage this, they developed a logistical circulatory system that turned the park into an industrial-scale processor of information, where boring supplies were treated with the same reverence as military ammunition as you settle into the steady, unmoving calm of the evening. Imagine the atmosphere of the registration and indexing rooms. The sound was the persistent shuffling of thousands of cards and the rhythmic thump of rubber stamps hitting paper. The air was dry and smelled of ink, wood pulp, and the sharp chemical scent of typewriter ribbon. This was the architecture of the index. Every name of a German officer, every mention of a fuel depot, and every ship's name was painstakingly transcribed onto a separate card and cross-referenced. The workers harbored a secret worry about data decay, fearing that the information they recorded today would be lost in the vast filing cabinets tomorrow. They envisioned a future where memory was mechanical, a belief that turned the alphabetical file into a sacred map of the enemy's mind. The hidden worries of the logistics officers focused on the peril of the supply chain during the height of the Blitz and the U-boat blockades. Even basic items like quality pencils and graph paper were in short supply. They understood that without pencils, the codebreakers were unarmed. This led to a state of extreme material vigilance, where every scrap of paper was used on both sides, and every pencil was sharpened until it was a mere nub. They harbored a secret worry that a bottleneck in the delivery of teletype rolls would bring the Colossus and the bombs to a jarring halt. To manage this, they operated a shadow economy of supplies, ensuring that the park always had the physical tools necessary to translate the unseen signals into readable text. The logistics of the secret also involved the physical movement of data before the secure teleprinter lines were fully established. Dispatch riders, mostly young men and women on motorcycles, roared across the British countryside, carrying locked pouches of intercepted This was the anxiety of the open road. They harbored a secret worry about the peril of the accident, fearing that a single skid on a rain-slicked road could leave ultra-secrets scattered in a ditch. These riders were the blood cells of the intelligence body, moving at high speeds through the blackout conditions of wartime England. They envisioned a world where speed was the only security, a philosophy that turned the nighttime ride into a high-stakes race against the clock. The architecture of the index was perhaps the most boring but vital part of the Bletchley infrastructure. In the index huts, thousands of women maintained a living database of the German military. They understood that information is only useful if you can find it, a philosophy that turned filing into a weapon of war. If a codebreaker found a reference to a station Z in a new message, the indexers could find every other mention of that station from the last 3 years in a matter of minutes. Their fear was not of the enemy's complexity, but of the clerk's error-thaw moment when a misfiled card would allow a German division to vanish from the Allied radar. They used their routine focus to build a fortress of facts. ensuring that the collective memory of the park was infallible. The contrast between the abstract brilliance of the cryptanalysts and the mundane precision of the indexers was the ultimate strength of Bletchley. The geniuses provided the keys, but the clerks provided the context. Their fear was not of the work, but of the interruption, the thought that the mountain of paper would stop moving, leaving the intelligence machine paralyzed. They used the rhythm of the filing to calm the nerves, finding a meditative peace in the orderly rows of cabinets. They envisioned a world where every detail mattered, a belief that made the boring act of sorting paper a heroic contribution to the victory. The filing cabinets are now museum pieces, and the dispatch riders have long since parked their bikes. But the energy of the organized secret remains. The belief that order is the parent of clarity offers a sense of protective, logistical comfort. You are not responsible for the filing of the cards or the delivery of the pouches. You are only a dweller within the enduring, quiet history of the great archive. The image of the neatly labeled drawer and the sharpened pencil acts as your guide. The data is stored, the path is clear, and the park is hushed by the weight of its own records. You are secure in the steady, unhurried peace of your own rest, where the only thing that matters is the deep stillness of the room as the moon hangs high over the silent city. Another layer of the park's existence becomes visible. The invisible shield of the internal watch. This was the security of silence, a pervasive, high-stakes system of counterintelligence designed to ensure that the secret of Bletchley remained within its wire fences. To live at Bletchley was to exist under a microscope of discretion. This was the anxiety of the unintended leak, the constant gnawing fear that a single, unguarded sentence in a local tea shop or a misplaced document in a communal dormitory could alert the Abwehr that their unbreakable Enigma was a sieve. They harbored a secret worry that the Germans were not just listening to the airwaves, but watching the gates. To manage this, they developed a culture of extreme internal surveillance, where every worker was both a guardian and a subject of the secret. As you settle into the weightless, calm expanse of the evening, imagine the atmosphere of the security office located in the heart of the mansion. The sound was the measured tread of the military police on the floorboards and the sharp, rhythmic snap of safes being locked for the night. The air was charged with a heavy vigilance, smelling of floor wax and the dry ozone of the high-frequency scanners used to check for internal radio transmissions. The security officers harbored a secret worry about the peril of the disgruntled worker, the fear that the immense pressure and boring living conditions would eventually drive someone to sell a fragment of the truth. They envisioned a future where the secret was the only reality, a belief that turned every new face into a potential threat. The hidden worries of the workers focused on the peril of the accidental omission. They understood that the Official Secrets Act was not a mere formality. It was a lifelong vow. They were repeatedly told that talk costs lives, a phrase that turned the simple act of social conversation into a minefield of the mind. They harbored a secret worry about speaking in sleep, fearing that the intense mental labor of the day would manifest as a nocturnal confession that their housemates might overhear. To manage this, they developed a social Mosca shallow, repetitive way of speaking about the weather, the rations, or the cinema that acted as a buffer for their true thoughts. They used their routine interactions to hide the depth of their knowledge, creating a veneer of the ordinary that was as impenetrable as any code. The architecture of internal security was a study in physical and psychological barriers. The park was divided into color-coded zones, and a pass for Hut 3 did not grant access to Hut 6. This compartmentalization of space ensured that no single individual, even if captured or compromised, could reveal the full scope of the operation. They feared the peril of the wide view, believing that too much knowledge was a burden that could break even the strongest spirit. They envisioned a world where ignorance was a form of protection, a philosophy that turned the lack of information into a comforting shield. To the worker, the locked door was not a restriction. It was a guarantee that they could not accidentally betray what they did not know. The role of the postal censorship and the telephone monitor was a critical, if unseen, part of the internal watch. Every letter sent from Bletchley was screened, and every phone call was liable to be interrupted. This was the anxiety of the monitored life. They understood that their private world was a public concern, a belief that made the act of writing home a strategic exercise. They used coded phrases for their families, describing their work as clerical or boring office duties, turning their heroic struggle into a drab existence in the eyes of their loved ones. Their fear was not of the censor's pen, but of the censor's silence, the thought that their words might be too revealing and never reach their destination at all. The contrast between the trust of the colleagues and the suspicion of the world was the ultimate psychological paradox of Bletchley. Inside the wire, they were partners in a miracle. Outside, they were strangers in a crowd. This dual identity was the source of their nocturnal fatigue. Their fear was not of the enemy's bombs, but of the friendly question, the moment when a well-meaning relative or a curious local would ask a question that they could not answer. They used the silence of the night to recalibrate the mask, ensuring that the security of silence remained intact for another 24 hours. The internal watch has been disbanded, and the safes in the mansion are now empty, but the energy of the guarded secret remains. The belief that some truths are too heavy for the world to carry offers a sense of protective, quiet gravity. You are not responsible for the monitoring of the mail or the guarding of the zones. You are only a dweller within the enduring, quiet history of the great vow. The image of the locked file and the unspoken word acts as your guide. The secret is held, the vow is kept, and the park is hushed by the strength of its own silence. You are secure in the steady, unhurried peace of your own rest, where the only thing that matters is the deep stillness of the room, as the mechanical chatter of the touring bombs and the rhythmic pulse of the Colossus machines echoed through the huts of Bletchley Park. A silent, invisible revolution was taking place. This was the technological leap, the transition from human-centered logic to the digital dawn of the modern computer, while the world outside was locked in a struggle of steel and fire. The workers at Bletchley were unknowingly architecting the future of the 21st century. This was the anxiety of the uncharted logic, the realization that the problems posed by the German Lorenz and Enigma ciphers had finally exceeded the biological speed of the human brain. They harbored a secret worry that the machines they were building would eventually become so complex that they would outpace their creators. To manage this, they treated their vacuum tubes and logic gates with the same reverence as ancient scrolls, viewing the machine as a sacred extensions of the human will. As you settle into the steady, unmoving calm of the evening, imagine the atmosphere of Hut, where the first electronic brains were taking shape. The sound was the persistent, high-pitched hum of thousands of glass valves and the rapid-fire clicking of electromagnetic relays. The air was unnaturally warm, smelling of hot copper, ozone, and the sharp, dry scent of electrical solder. This was the architecture of the virtual. For the first time in history, information was being treated as a physical substance that could be manipulated at the speed of light. The workers harbored a secret worry about electronic fragility, fearing that a single blown valve or a dust mote on a paper tape could derail a calculation of immense strategic importance. They envisioned a future where memory was made of light and electricity, a belief that turned the boring maintenance of wires and switches into a mission of cosmic scale. The hidden worries of the engineers, like Tommy Flowers and Alan Turing, focused on the peril of the unproven theory. They were building machines based on mathematical concepts that many in the military establishment viewed as eccentric or fanciful. They understood that they were gambling with the war on the strength of a vacuum tube. This led to a state of extreme technical defiance, where they scavenged parts from post office exchanges and built Colossus in a matter of months. They harbored a secret worry that the electronic brain would be a magnificent failure, a mirage of logic that would vanish when the power was cut. To manage this, they built redundancy into every circuit, ensuring that the logic could survive the physical failure of its parts. They envisioned a world where binary was the universal language of the secret, a philosophy that made the flicker of a valve the most important light in the dark. The technological leap also involved the automation of the intuition. The Colossus was not just a calculator. It was a pattern-matching machine. It could remember strings of letters and compare them at a speed that made the human eye seem static. This was the anxiety of the replaced mind. The codebreakers harbored a secret worry that the human element, the aha moment and the creative spark would be swallowed by the machine. Yet, they found that the more the machine took over the boring, repetitive work, the more the human spirit was freed to tackle the higher mysteries of the code. They used the machine as a multiplier of the soul, a belief that turned the vacuum tube into an ally of the intellect. They envisioned a world where man and machine worked in a perfect, silent symbiosis. The architecture of the first computer was a study in sprawling complexity. The Colossus was a wall of equipment, a monument to the invisible. It did not have a screen or a keyboard. Its output was a stream of 5-hole paper tape that spilled into baskets like digital confetti. They feared the peril of the information overload, believing that as the machines got faster, the human ability to act would be the new bottleneck. This created a culture of high-speed analysis, where the park had to reinvent its own internal logistics to keep up with the speed of the silicon. They used their routine calibrations to tame the lightning, ensuring that the electronic brain remained a servant of the victory. The contrast between the fragile glass of the valves and the brutal steel of the war was the ultimate paradox of Bletchley. The lightest of materials were being used to defeat the heaviest of weapons. This asymmetry of power was the source of their nocturnal hope. Their fear was not of the machine's power, but of the machines silence the moment when the glowing heart of the colossus would go dark, leaving them blind to the Lorenz secrets. They used the steady hum of the equipment to calm the mind, finding a rhythmic peace in the electronic heartbeat. They envisioned a world where logic would eventually replace violence, a belief that made the technological leap a moral imperative. The vacuum tubes have been replaced by billions of microscopic transistors, and the Colossus is now a reconstruction for music. But the energy of the digital birth remains. The belief that the mind can build its own wings offers a sense of protective technological clarity. You are not responsible for the maintenance of the valves or the reading of the tape. You are only a dweller within the enduring, quiet history of the digital dawn. The image of the glowing tube and the streaming tape acts as your guide. The calculation is complete, the logic is stored, and the park is hushed by the power of its own creation. You are secure in the steady, unhurried peace of your own rest, where the only thing that matters is the deep stillness of the room as the moon casts long, silver shadows over the gravel paths connecting the huts. We must acknowledge the invisible army that served as the tireless heart of Bletchley Park. By the height of the war in 1944, nearly 75% of the 10,000-strong workforce were women. This was a social revolution conducted in absolute silence. From the Women's Royal Naval Service, WRNS, or WRENS, to female civilians recruited from universities and clerical pools. These women were the propulsion system of the intelligence machine. They were not merely support staff. They were the operators of the bombs, the maintainers of the massive indexes, and the interceptors of the high-speed Morse code. This was the anxiety of the unseen pivot, the realization that the most masculine of enterprises, a world war, was being steered by the steady hands of a generation of women who had been told their place was elsewhere. As you settle into the steady, unmoving calm of the evening, imagine the atmosphere of the bomb sheds, staffed by the wrens. The sound was a mechanical roar of thousands of rotating drums that drowned out all conversation. The air was thick with the scent of machine oil, hot metal, and industrial soap. The wrens harbored a secret worry about mechanical misalignment, fearing that a single loose belt or a smeared contact in the complex wiring would cause the machine to miss the stop that held the key to the day's Enigma settings. They envisioned a future where their technical mastery would be recognized. But in the present, they worked in a state of heroic anonymity. They used their routine focus to tame the giants, turning the heavy iron of the bombs into a delicate instrument of the intellect. The hidden worries of the female indexers and clerks focused on the peril of the human chain. They understood that the intelligence produced by the geniuses in the mansion was only as good as the data they were provided. They harbored a secret worry that a misfiled card or a transcription error would send a false signal through the nervous system of the park. This led to a state of extreme clerical vigilance, where perfection was the only acceptable standard. They envisioned a world where order was a form of resistance, a belief that turned the boring act of sorting thousands of paper slips into a strategic defense. To the woman in the index hut, the filing cabinet was her trench, and the pencil was her rifle. They used the rhythm of the alphabet to anchor their purpose, finding a meditative peace in the structure of the data. The role of women also extended into the high-level analysis. While history often highlights the men, women like Joan Clark, Mavis Beatty, and Margaret Rock were performing world-class cryptanalysis alongside Turing and Welchman. They harbored a secret worry about the peril of the dismissed, incite the fear that their contributions would be filtered through the lens of gender and lost. Yet, inside the meritocracy of the huts, the code did not care about the voice that cracked it. They understood that logic is universal, a philosophy that allowed them to rise above the expectations of the era. They used their intuition and precision to find the flaws in the German logic, turning their excluded status into a unique perspective that saw patterns others missed. The architecture of the Wrens quarters and the civilian hostels was a study in collective resilience. They lived in crowded, unheated dormitories and shared meager rations, yet they maintained a vibrant internal culture. They harbored a secret worry about the post-war erasure, fearing that once the silence was no longer required, the world would forget what they had done. To manage this, they built lifelong bonds of trust that were never spoken of outside the wire. They envisioned a world where their service was a secret fire, a belief that made the cold rooms and the long nights bearable. They used their routine, social lives, the impromptu concerts, and the shared books to protect the spirit from the grinding intensity of the work. The contrast between the domestic expectation of the 1940s and the scientific reality of their daily lives was the ultimate source of their quiet power. A woman might spend her day calibrating the world's first computer and her evening mending a pair of stockings by candlelight. This dual existence was the source of their nocturnal strength. Their fear was not of the difficulty of the math, but of the end of the mystery, the moment when the park would close and they would be expected to return to the ordinary. They used the silence of the night to hold on to the secret, ensuring that the invisible army remained the unshakable foundation of the victory. The huts are now quiet, and the invisible army has finally taken its place in the light of history, but the energy of the steady hand remains. The belief that the quietest workers are often the most vital offers a sense of protective, social clarity. You are not responsible for the maintenance of the index or the operation of the drums. You are only a dweller within the enduring, quiet history of the great feminine watch. The image of the spinning rotors and the sharpened pencil acts as your guide. The data is processed, the machine is true, and the park is hushed by the strength of the collective will. You are secure in the steady, unhurried peace of your own rest, where the only thing that matters is the deep stillness of the room. As the deep stillness of the midnight hour settles over the Buckinghamshire countryside, we must confront the most shadow-filled room in Bletchley Park, the room where the ethics of the secret were weighed against the survival of a nation. This was the anxiety of the moral calculist, the heavy, often agonizing realization that the intelligence produced in the huts was a double-edged sword. To know the ultra-secret was to possess the power of a god, but to be bound by the constraints of a ghost. The codebreakers harbored a secret worry that their very success would force them into a position of passive complicity, where they would watch a tragedy unfold through the clear glass of a deciphered message, and be forbidden from reaching out to stop it. To protect Ultra was to protect the source, and sometimes the price of that protection was paid in human lives. As you settle into the steady, unmoving calm of your own evening, imagine the atmosphere of the sift rooms. where the most sensitive decrypts were handled. The sound was not the roar of battle, but the haunting silence of a room where a decision was being made to withhold information. The air was charged with a heavy, ethical weight, smelling of cold paper and extinguished candles. A codebreaker might read a message detailing an upcoming air raid on a specific city or the precise location of a vulnerable convoy. They harbored a secret worry that strategic necessity was merely a polite name for human sacrifice. They envisioned a future where every life could be saved by the truth, but in the present they were trapped in a logic of the lesser evil. They used their routine precision to distance the soul from the consequences, turning the act of knowing into a disciplined burden. The hidden worries of the high-level analysts and the link officers focused on the peril of the tipped hand. They understood, with a chilling clarity, that if the Allied response to a deciphered message was too perfect, too timely, or too efficient, the German High Command would immediately realize that the Enigma was broken. This led to the architecture of the necessary loss. They harbored a secret worry that they were playing with the lives of their own brothers to ensure the ultimate defeat of the enemy. They envisioned a world where deception was the only path to victory, a philosophy that required them to mask their knowledge behind coincidence or scout plane sightings. To the worker who had just cracked the code for a devastating attack, the silence of the command felt like a personal failure. The ethics of the secret also involved the burden of the partial truth, because the codebreakers saw the war through fragments of text. They often knew the how and the where of an enemy move, but they did not always know the if of the Allied countermove. This created a state of eternal uncertainty. They harbored a secret worry about analytical hubris, fearing that their moral decisions were based on incomplete data. They envisioned a world where total information led to total peace, but they lived in a world where more information often led to more difficult choices. They used their routine focus to narrow the scope of their responsibility, believing that their only moral duty was to break the code, leaving the consequences to the generals and the politicians. The role of the ultra-secret in the Coventry myth or the Battle of the Atlantic highlights the nocturnal weight of these decisions. Whether it was allowing a raid to proceed to protect the source or rerouting a fleet at the last possible second, the ethics of the secret required a hardness of the spirit that was rarely asked of a civilian. They harbored a secret worry about the post-war judgment, fearing that when the silence was finally broken, the world would accuse them of playing chess with souls. To manage this, they developed an internal moral coda belief that short-term sorrow was the tax of long-term salvation. They used the rhythm of the work to drown out the questions, finding a meditative peace in the purity of the mathematics. Contrast between the innocence of the Buckinghamshire garden and the cynicism of the secret. War was the ultimate source of their nocturnal fatigue. They would step out of a room where they had just signed a death warrant by choosing to stay silent and find themselves in a peaceful world that knew nothing of their struggle. This moral isolation was the tax of the intelligence worker. Their fear was not of the external judgment, but of the internal mirror, the moment when they would have to look at themselves and ask if the secret was worth the sacrifice. They used the silence of the night to recalibrate the conscience, ensuring that the ethics of the secret remained a guiding light rather than a consuming fire. The files are now open. and the moral dilemmas of Bletchley, but the energy of the heavy choice remains. The belief that the truth is a burden that must be carried with honor offers a sense of protective, ethical gravity. You are not responsible for the decisions of the command or the protection of the source. You are only a dweller within the enduring, quiet history of the great conscience. The image of the deciphered warning and the necessary silence acts as your guide. The secret is held, the price is understood, and the park is hushed by the weight of its own integrity. You are secure in the steady, unhurried peace of your own rest, where the only thing that matters is the deep stillness of the room. As the late-night mist rolls across the damp grass of the estate, we must turn our attention to the invisible conflict the shadow war waged not against the German military on the front lines, but against the German intelligence agencies themselves, the Abwehr and the Cipher. This was a high-stakes game of cat and mouse, played in the abstract realm of signals and ciphers. To the codebreakers at Bletchley, the German intelligence officers were not just enemies. They were intellectual rivals. This was the anxiety of the mirror image, the constant, nagging fear that while Bletchley was reading the German mail, a similar hut in the Black Forest or a suburb of Berlin was reading the British codes. They harbored a secret worry that the superiority of the Allied logic was a temporary illusion, and that, at any moment, the invisible conflict could tip in favor of the Reich. As you settle into the steady, unmoving calm of the evening, imagine the atmosphere of Hut 3 and Hut 6 during a complex double-cross operation. The sound was the persistent hum of the teleprinters and the soft rustle of intercepted reports from German spies. The air was thick with the scent of strong coffee and old tobacco, a heavy atmosphere of nocturnal suspicion. The codebreakers harbored a secret worry about analytical entrapment, the fear that the Germans were feeding them specific information through the Enigma to lead the Allies into a trap. They envisioned a future where every signal was a lie, a belief that turned the act of decryption into a minefield of the mind. They used their routine skepticism to test every word, looking for the subtle inconsistency that would reveal a German deception. The hidden worries of the analysts focused on the peril of the compromised. Agent Bletchley was instrumental in the double-cross system, where captured German spies were turned into Allied double agents by reading the Abwehr's own Enigma traffic. The codebreakers could see exactly what the Germans believed about these agents and what information they were asking for. They harbored a secret worry that the double agents would be tripped up by a single piece of information that the codebreakers had failed to decipher in time. This led to a state of extreme operational synchronization, where the mathematical speed of the huts had to match the narrative speed of the spies on the ground. They envisioned a world where fiction was more powerful than fact, a philosophy that turned the deciphered message into a script for a play. The invisible conflict also involved the war of the ciphers. The Abwehr used a specialized version of the Enigma machine that lacked the plugboard of the military version but had more complex rotating rotors. This required a different logical approach, a pure mathematical hunt that pushed the codebreakers to their limits. They harbored a secret worry about the peril of the sudden silence. If the Abwehr changed their wiring or their internal procedures, the ultra-intelligence stream would run dry. leaving the Allied counterintelligence officers blind to the movements of the German Secret Service. To manage this, they developed a culture of constant innovation, always looking for the next version of the machine before it was even deployed. They envisioned a world where the only constant was change, a belief that made the boring work of daily monitoring a vital defense. The role of traffic analysis was a critical weapon in this invisible struggle. Even when the messages themselves could not be read, the codebreakers studied the volume and direction of the German radio traffic. They understood that the pattern of the signal is a signal in itself, a philosophy that turned the radio spectrum into a tactical map. If the Abwehr headquarters in Berlin suddenly increased its transmissions to the coast of France, it signaled an impending operation regardless of what the messages said. Their fear was not of the content, but of the activity, the moment when the invisible conflict shifted from observation to action. They used their routine plotting of radio call signs to stalk the enemy's thoughts, creating a mental model of the German high command. The contrast between the quiet intellect of Bletchley and the violent ambitions of the SD was the ultimate source of their nocturnal intensity. They were fighting a clean war of mathematics against a dirty war of espionage and sabotage. This moral asymmetry was the source of their quiet resolve. Their fear was not of the enemy's strength, but of the enemy's ruthlessness, the thought that their logic would be defeated by brute force. They used the silence of the huts to insulate the mind, focusing on the purity of the puzzle to avoid being overwhelmed by the horror of the conflict. They envisioned a world where truth would eventually disarm the spy, a belief that made the invisible conflict a moral crusade conducted in the dark. The Abwehr is gone, and the double-cross files are now public record, but the energy of the shadow duel remains. The belief that vigilance is the price of security offers a sense of protective, intellectual clarity. You are not responsible for the monitoring of the spies or the testing of the deceptions. You are only a dweller within the enduring, quiet history of the Great Shadow War. The image of the intercepted report and the double-agent script acts as your guide. The duel is won, the secret is safe, and the park is hushed by the weight of its own victory. You are secure in the steady, unhurried peace of your own rest, where the only thing that matters is the deep stillness of the room. As the spring of 1945 brought the first whispers of a true and lasting peace to the Buckinghamshire countryside, a strange and hollow atmosphere began to permeate the huts of Bletchley Park. This was the transition to peace, not a moment of boisterous celebration, but one of bittersweet erasure. While the rest of the world prepared for victory in Europe, VE Day, with street parties and bonfires, the codebreakers were faced with a final order that felt like a betrayal of their own history. Churchill's directive was clear. The machines were to be broken, the records were to be burned, and the secret of the park was to be buried so deep that it would seem as if it had never existed. This was the anxiety of the vanishing legacy, the realization that their heroic struggle, the very thing that had defined their lives for 6 years, was to be scrubbed from the record by the very hand that had guided it. As you settle into the steady, unmoving calm of the evening, imagine the atmosphere of the sledgehammer rooms during the final weeks of the war. The sound was not the rhythmic heartbeat of the bombs, but the jarring, violent crash of heavy tools smashing through the copper and bronze of the machines. The air was thick with the scent of burning paper, charred wood, and the acrid smoke of thousands of blueprints being fed into massive incinerators. The workers harbored a secret worry about historical amputation, the fear that they were destroying the evidence of a miracle that the world desperately needed to understand. They envisioned a future where they were ghosts in their own lives, a belief that turned the act of destruction into a funeral for the intellect. They used their routine precision to systematically dismantle their own achievements, turning the birthplace of the computer back into a collection of boring, empty sheds. The hidden worries of the codebreakers focused on the peril of the unspoken truth. They were called into small groups and reminded of the Official Secrets Act with a new, chilling intensity. They were told that the war of the ciphers was not over, even if the war of the tanks was. They harbored a secret worry that the silence they had practiced for 6 years would become a permanent prison. They envisioned a world where they could never explain their absence from the front, never tell their children why they had sat in an office while the world burned. This was the internalized exile, the belief that the greatest victory is the one that can never be claimed. They used their routine final tasks, the scrubbing of the desks and the locking of the empty drawers, as a way to compartmentalize the loss, finding a stoic peace in the finality of the order. The transition to peace also involved the dispersal of the minds. The cerebral melting pot was poured back into the ordinary world. Mathematicians returned to quiet university halls, wrens returned to domestic lives, and clerks vanished back into the city streets of London and Manchester. They harbored a secret worry about the peril of the ordinary, fearing that a life without the intensity of the secret would be hollow and gray. They envisioned a world where the math was easy but life was hard, a philosophy that made the return to the mundane feel like a descent into the shadows. To the person who had held the fate of fleets in their hands, the prospect of a boring post-war career was a source of quiet dread. They used their last days at the park to memorize the faces of their colleagues, knowing they could never speak to them of their shared past. The architecture of the final erasure was a study in strategic silence. The Colossus machines, those electronic cathedrals of logic, were broken down into pieces, so small they could never be reconstructed. The blueprints were scattered or reduced to ash. They feared the peril of the Cold War, believing that if the secret of Bletchley fell into the hands of the new Soviet rivals, the intelligence edge of the West would be lost forever. This created a culture of extreme historical denial, where the park was officially forgotten for 30 years. They used the camouflage of the ordinary to hide the ruins of their greatness, turning the huts into boring storage units for the Ministry of Works. They envisioned a world where nothing remained but the impact, a belief that made the death of the machines a strategic necessity. The contrast between the grandeur of the achievement and the modesty of the departure was the ultimate testament to the Bletchley character. There were no medals given in public, no parades through the center of the village. One day the huts were full, the next they were echoing shells. This vanishing act was the source of their nocturnal strength. Their fear was not of being forgotten, but of breaking the trust the moment when the weight of the piece would cause someone to speak the secret. They used the silence of the night to lock away the memory. ensuring that the transition to peace was as perfectly encrypted as any Enigma message. The huts have been rebuilt, and the machines have been painstakingly reconstructed by historians. But the energy of the final departure remains. The belief that the truest service is the one that asks for nothing offers a sense of protective, humble clarity. You are not responsible for the destruction of the records or the guarding of the silence. You are only a dweller within the enduring, quiet history of the great dispersal. The image of the smoldering incinerator and the empty desk acts as your guide. The war is over, the secret is buried, and the park is hushed by the weight of its own absence. You are secure in the steady, unhurried peace of your own rest, where the only thing that matters is the deep stillness of the room. As the final light of our journey through Bletchley Park fades into a deep, velvety darkness, we arrive at the legacy of Bletchley, the moment when the silent victory finally emerged from the shadows of the official secrets. Act to rewrite the history of the 20th century. For 3 decades, the world believed the war was won solely by the thunder of the guns and the bravery of the beaches. The veterans of the huts lived in a state of social invisibility, watching as history books were written that omitted their entire existence. This was the anxiety of the unrecognized truth, the persistent, quiet hope that one day the intellectual shield they had built would be acknowledged as the foundation of the Allied triumph. To finally speak the word ultra in the 1970s was not just a breach of silence. It was a restoration of the soul. As you settle into the profound, unmoving calm of the night, imagine the atmosphere of the park today, now a place of pilgrimage and remembrance. The sound is no longer the clatter of the bombs or the hiss of the radio, but the soft murmur of voices reflecting on the sheer scale of the achievement. The air is clear, smelling of manicured lawns and the old wood of the restored huts. The veterans, now in the twilight of their own lives, harbored a secret worry that the electronic brains they pioneered would be seen as mere curiosities rather than the ancestors of the digital age. They envisioned a future where the logic of Bletchley would be the universal language of the world, a belief that turned their boring wartime labor into the blueprint for the modern mind. The hidden worries of the historians and the survivors focused on the peril of the statistical victory. They understood that, by cracking the Enigma, they had shortened the war by at least 2 years and saved over 11 million lives. Yet, they harbored a secret worry that the human element of fatigue, the eccentricity, and the moral burden would be lost in the mathematical data. They envisioned a world where intelligence was recognized as the greatest weapon, a philosophy that shifted the center of gravity of history from the battlefield to the brain. They used their routine final years to record their stories, ensuring that the anonymous hero was finally given a name. To the Codebreaker, the legacy was not the machine, but the possibility that the mind could defeat the sword. The legacy of Bletchley also fundamentally changed our understanding of the digital dawn. The work of Alan Turing, once a classified mystery, is now recognized as the DNA of the computer. They harbored a secret worry about the peril of the unintended consequence, the fear that the logic machines built to stop a tyrant would eventually be used to invade the privacy of the individuals they were meant to protect. They envisioned a world where cryptography was the guardian of freedom, a belief that made their wartime struggle a perpetual mission. They used the silence of their service to model the responsibility of the scientist, proving that the pursuit of truth must always be tempered by the defense of the human spirit. The architecture of the modern reflection is one of profound gratitude. The huts are no longer cramped workplaces, but monuments to the quiet. They represent the power of the collective, the proof that 10,000 individuals from different backgrounds could work in perfect, silent harmony toward a single noble goal. They feared the peril of the fractured world, believing that the unity of the park was a miracle that could never be repeated. Yet, the legacy of Bletchley offers a nocturnal hope, the idea that even in the darkest hours, the light of the intellect can find a path through the chaos. They used the rhythm of their victory to anchor the future, finding a meditative peace in the knowledge that their secret was the key to the world's survival. The contrast between the profound secrecy of 1945 and the global recognition of 2026 is the ultimate completion of the circle. The boring office workers of the past are the intellectual giants of the present. This ascension of the spirit is the source of their eternal rest. Their fear was never of failing, but of failing the future, the thought that their logic would not be enough to save the world. They used the silence of the night to yield to the history, ensuring that the legacy of Bletchley remained a guiding star for every generation that followed. The machines are now at rest. The huts are stilled by the evening, and the secret of the park has finally become the wisdom of the ages. The belief that the mind is the ultimate fortress offers a sense of protective, eternal clarity. You are not responsible for the guarding of the legacy or the interpretation of history. You are only a dweller within the enduring, quiet peace of the completed decryption. The image of the unbroken line of logic and the final clear word acts as your guide. The secret is shared, the war is won, and the park is hushed by the weight of its own immortality. You are secure in the steady, unhurried peace of your own rest, where the only thing that matters is the deep stillness of the room.